Hey friends, Matt aka Martiln here, and in this video I want to show you a cool technique for crafting your own kick drums using synthesis with Ableton Live's Operator device. Let's dive right in. Okay, so here I've just got a basic MIDI track in Ableton Live with an operator loaded up onto it, and I've just got two notes on C3, and currently it sounds like this. Pretty uninspiring, pretty unlike a kick drum. We're going to change that really quickly. So there are lots of different ways to synthesize a kick drum using Operator, and there's plenty of videos out there already showing you different ways to do so. But this method I'm about to show you is something I haven't seen out there a lot. If we think about the parts that make up a kick drum, we can kind of break it down into two distinct aspects. There is the transient at the start of the sound and the body, which is the kind of rest of the sound, which is where you get that low frequency oomph from. And we're going to simulate these two different parts of the sound using all of the different oscillators or operators inside of Ableton Live's Operator. Now for this, before we start, because of the way I want to actually lay out this synthesizer, I'm going to go to the global section and I'm going to change the algorithm to this second one from the right. And what this means is that we have operator A and B going directly out of the synthesizer, and operator D is feeding into operator C, modulating its frequency. So now to craft our fundamental, I'm going to pull down the level of operator A and we're going to use operator C as the fundamental frequency or the kind of body of the kick drum. Now, if you want to tune your kick drum to a particular key, I suppose you could do that and you could leave fixed off in this particular instance, but I'm actually going to turn on the fixed frequency mode. And what this allows me to do is set the exact frequency for this particular oscillator. I personally don't always like to tune my kick drums to a particular note, which is why I'm using this method. Now I'm going to set the frequency of this operator to 50 Hertz, which is a good kind of base frequency for a kick drum. Now we have a sound that's like this. The next thing we need to do is shape the envelope of this oscillator. And we're going to go into the envelope, and I'm actually going to set the loop mode down the bottom left here to trigger. And what this means is that it's going to play through the entirety of the envelope, skipping the sustain phase, regardless of how long the incoming note is, which is really great when we want to craft a kick drum or a percussive sound of a certain length and not have it tied to the length of our MIDI note. So now if I play our sound, we're actually going to get a 50 Hertz tone ringing out for a second with a release then of 400 milliseconds. And as I reduce the decay, we can change the length of this beep. If I turn down the release, it's going to just cut off immediately as well. But that'll result in some kind of click, so I'm going to leave this release at about 300 milliseconds for the moment. We can tune this later. Now we want the impactful part of the kick drum. We're going to create this by using a pitch envelope. So I'm going to go over to the pitch envelope section in the right hand side and engage the pitch envelope. And much like with the envelope for operator C, I'm going to set the loop mode to trigger, meaning that the envelope isn't tied to the length of the MIDI note. Make sure the pitch envelope amount is set to 100%. And now we can begin to adjust the pitch envelope in order to craft the body of this sound. Right off the bat, we have something that sounds like this. If you can't hear this well, you'll need to be wearing some headphones or with some good studio monitors. And what I'm going to do first off is actually increase this initial value all the way up to plus 48 semitones. And now there are 5 different parameters that we can play around with here to really shape how the pitch envelope of this kick drum moves over time. These parameters are the attack, the decay, the peak, and if we click on the attack and decay words here, we can also change the attack slope and the decay slope. And by adjusting these parameters, we get really fine-tuned control of the pitch envelope on this synthesizer. Let's increase the attack a little bit, increase the peak value, change the decay. And we can play around with these parameters until we get something that we like. I'm going to change the decay slope a little bit, change the attack slope. And then once we have a good set of values, we can go back to our initial oscillator and begin to shape the envelope here as well. We can change parameters such as the decay, the release, the sustain, and the attack. Now, because we're crafting the body of the kick drum here, we can have a little bit of attack because we're going to be adding a transient later with some of the other operators. If you prefer to have no attack, you can also set the phase of this oscillator to 25 or so that it starts not on that zero crossing point, which will give you a nice click at the start of the sound. In fact, you could just leave it like this, and then as we adjust the attack, we'll lose that click in the first place anyway. And from here, you can continue to adjust the shape of the fundamental body of your kick drum by adjusting these different parameters, as well as the amount of the pitch envelope, which can really shape the impact of the kick drum. In order to add a little bit more crunch to this sound, now what we can do is actually use operator D to modulate the frequency of operator C. I'm going to go back to operator D here, and we're going to also set this to a fixed frequency. And then we're going to change again the loop mode of this envelope to trigger. And I'm actually going to reduce the sustain of this envelope all the way down to 0. So we're just getting the initial burst of this sound. Let's increase the level of this operator. And so that's what it sounds like on a sine wave. But if we want to add a little bit more crunch to this, I'm actually going to go and change the wave shape here to the noise looped, which is basically a tiny little sample of white noise that we can pitch up or down, which allows us to really shape the timbre of this kind of crunch. If I now increase the frequency, we can add that kind of beatery sound of the kick drum. And if we want it to be a more full frequency spectrum noise, we can actually increase the feedback all the way up to 100%, which feeds the oscillator back into itself and creates basically just noise. You can also really play around with the timbre of this noise by increasing the multi amount to 10, and then this frequency control here gains much more range. The phase control here is also really fun to play around with, as it can shape the timbre too. Particularly at the initial click of this sound. And now you have your fundamental or body of the kick drum, and you can continue to adjust parameters as you like, adjusting things like the envelope of operator C, the level of operator D, and the envelope and the depth of the pitch envelope. Don't forget that you can also change the fundamental frequency of operator C in order to change the tone or the tuning of your kick drum. And now we're going to craft the transient of our kick drum. And for this, I'm going to use both operator A and operator B. To start, let's use operator A to craft a kind of noisy transient. So for this, we're going to set our operator again to a fixed frequency, change the loop mode to trigger, and reduce the sustain all the way down. And now, because we're crafting the kind of noisy beta transient, I'm going to change our wave shape here again to the noise looped. And once again, the reason I'm using noise looped here is because we get the ability to really shape the tone or the timbre of this transient. Now, as I increase the output level of operator A, we get that noise coming through. Let's increase this all the way up to 0. So obviously that's far too long for a transient at the moment. So let's go back to our envelope for this operator and reduce the decay. And now we can really shape the timbre of this initial transient with the frequency control of our operator. And much like when we were adjusting the kind of crunch of our body, we can also change the phase and the feedback of this particular operator to adjust the timbre even further. If you want a less clicky sound, you can also introduce a little bit of attack here. And this is really useful if you're trying to emulate a more acoustic sounding kick drum. Now we can also add in another transient layer to give ourselves a little bit more tone, timbre, and click. For this, we're going to use operator B. And in order to speed up the process a little bit, I'm actually going to click on operator B, right click in the envelope area, and click on copy from oscillator A, so that we just get our settings and we don't have to set up the operator in the same way we've been setting up our operators previously. With operator B, what I want to create is a little bit more of that kind of knocking sound. So in order to do this, I'm going to change our wave shape here actually to something like a sine, or maybe even a square or a triangle wave. You can play around with different wave shapes here depending on what you want. For the moment, let's start with a triangle wave. Now, in order to hear this a little bit more clearly, I'm actually going to mute operator A and operator C, so we get a really clear idea of what this knock is sounding like. Let's reduce the feedback. And let's increase the frequency, decrease the attack, And now you can also choose to have this operator either controlled or not controlled by the pitch envelope. If you want it as more of a kind of knock sound, I would actually recommend not having it controlled by the pitch envelope. So I'm going to go to our pitch envelope section over here on the right, and in the destination A section, I can unselect operator B, and in fact I can also unselect operator A and operator D so that we don't have those noises affected by the pitch envelope either. This can drastically affect the sound, so just be aware of this from the get-go. It's a really important setting to play around with. So now our knock is sounding more like a knock. I can re-engage operator A and operator C, and then I can blend in this sound to taste. You can again play around with things like the decay, the attack, the frequency, and the feedback and phase of this operator to really shape the timbre and tone. You can have this as a really subtle layer, or you can have this as a really prominent layer. It's really over to you. Once you've set up all of these different sounds, you can go and further adjust things like envelopes, time, timbre, and amounts to really shape the sound to your liking. And if you have some settings and lengths that you really like, you can also experiment with the time control to adjust the length of all of the envelopes in your operator at once, which can help you to just either lengthen or shorten your kick drum with a single control. If you're finding that your kick drum is too dull, also make sure that your filter is turned off, and you can also go to the tone control here and increase this up to 100%, which will allow operator to generate much higher frequencies. Here's it with the tone control at 70%. Take a listen to the difference at 100%. Kind of like a low pass filter, but slightly different. From here, we can add further processing and effects such as EQ, compression, saturation, clipping, and limiting to further bring out the sound and shape it to our liking. So I've gone ahead and changed some of the parameters of the initial operator to my liking, added some EQ, some saturation, and a limiter. And now, as another way of analyzing my kick drum, what I'm going to do is actually create a new audio track so that I can look at the waveform of this kick drum. I'm going to mute the audio track, set the input to operator 1, change the setting here to post effects, record, enable the track. And now if I increase the size of this audio track and hit record, what's going to happen when I play is that we'll be able to see the waveform of the kick drum that we've created so that we can craft it even further using our eyes as well as our ears. So for example, I can see right away that this is quite a flat kick drum, and if I wanted it to be a little bit more transient-y, what I could do is go back to my operator and change the envelope of our fundamental frequency. So I could go to the envelope, maybe reduce the sustain here and play around with decay to change the length. Or I could increase the sustain back up, reduce the decay, and play around with the release to change the length. Now, this is a really versatile and super simple technique for crafting and creating your own kick drums that opens up a wide variety of possibilities. And what I've actually gone and done is put all of this into a single, easy to use Ableton Live rack so that you can easily craft your own kick drums without having to go through this entire process every single time. If you want to grab this rack for yourself, there'll be a link down below in the description where you can do so from my Buy Me a Coffee page, but let me just run you through it really quickly. Okay, so here we have Martiln's Kick Synthesizer version 1, and it might look pretty complicated, but it's actually fairly simple and straightforward to use. Right out of the gate, this is what it sounds like. Now, in order to be able to access all of the parameters really easily and quickly with macros, I have had to use 3 instances of operator here, but it's basically the same process as if I'm only using 1 instance of operator. It's purely for ease of macros. So let me run you through what's going on here. First off, on the left, we have really easy control over the level of the fundamental and the level of the transient, the 2 different layers that we created before. Next, we have the ability to switch between whether we're controlling parameters of the fundamental or of the transient, and we also have a section where you can layer it with a sample if you want to. There's no samples in here. You can simply choose your own sample and adjust it accordingly. I've just added the possibility for you to be able to do that rather than you having to create a new chain yourself. Let's take a look at the fundamental chain, and let's actually turn down the level of the transient so that we can just hear this chain. Here we get the ability to adjust all of the parameters that we were adjusting of operator C before, such as the frequency, initial value, attack value, peak, decay, sustain, and release. We get the ability to control the amount of crunch as we were doing with operator D, the timbre and the decay of that crunch, and then we also get the ability to control all of the important parameters of the pitch envelope for our fundamental. This allows you to really craft that fundamental to your liking without getting too in the weeds inside of Operator itself. If you'd like to access parameters that aren't mapped to these macros, you can of course open up the rack and adjust the operator as you'd like, but hopefully you shouldn't need to. Next, let's switch over to the transients chain. So we'll click on the transients chain, turn down the level of the fundamental and up the level of the transient so we can just hear the transient. And here we get access to all of the main parameters of both our noise transient and our kind of knock transient that we were working with before. We get the ability to change aspects of the envelope for each of them, such as the initial, attack, peak, and decay. And then for the noise, we get control over the timbre, a high pass filter, which I've added just because I can, because I'm using a third operator, and the phase of the noise. Let's hear the noise in isolation. And then with the knock, we also get the ability to control the frequency, the amount of feedback, and the phase as well. Let's turn down the noise and hear the knock in isolation. I've actually created this knock with a square wave, but again, if you would like to adjust that waveform, you can simply open up the rack, navigate to the knock rack, and go and adjust the waveform from square to whatever other waveform you would like. I just kind of ran out of macros. Next, in order to just give you some simple controls over shaping the kick drum, I've provided an EQ here, which just allows you to shape the frequency. And this kick shape rack, which has a transient kind of shaper in it, allowing you to adjust the attack and sustain of the kick drum, as well as the time of the attack. There's a tilt EQ, which is using my tilt EQ that you can find as part of my utility racks, which just allows you to either brighten up or dull the sound, depending on your liking. And then there's also a hard clipper and a limiter, as well as an output gain. And then for those of you, if you want to get really nerdy, there is a spectrum analyzer at the end so you can analyze the output spectrum of your kick drum as a whole. And that is the kick drum synthesizer. If you want to grab it for yourself, you can find a link down below where you can download it from my Buy Me a Coffee page. Otherwise, check out this video right here to see my snare designer rack in action. And I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.